Okay, so qRules Training Day 1. Again, my name is Hilary Stupa. I'm a software developer with qdabra software, and I do quite a lot of work on qRules. So please consider me your qRules point of contact if you think of an interesting feature that you'd like to see added, or if you run into an interesting bug. Do let me know. I'm going to put my email address here in chat real quick so you've got it. And also we do have the forum as a resource when you have issues. So let me see if my PowerPoint is going to change slides for me. By the way, you should be aware that this is I'm not used to this webinar technology yet. I've only used this application one time before, so I'm still a little shaky in it. So please be patient when I have technical difficulties. I don't think it's an if at this point. So qRules, I'm guessing everybody here has used it at least a little. You've been through a getting started or something like that. Maybe you've done some more complex things. What we've tried to do with qRules is we've tried to fill the gaps in InfoPath. And by gaps, I mean there's some functionality in InfoPath that doesn't seem to be there. You know, stuff that you kind of look at and you're like, well, why doesn't it do this? Shouldn't it do this? It works so closely with SharePoint. Why can't it submit to a SharePoint list natively? All of these things that leave us a little bit baffled sometimes as we start designing forms, and even the simplest forms sometimes it seems could use just a teeny bit of code to do one more thing or one different thing. qRules is a compiled DLL, it's a code DLL, and it allows you to leverage code without having to write code. If you do already write code, you're a programmer, you can also add this DLL as a reference to your form, to your code in your form, so that you don't have to rewrite some of this common functionality. You can leverage a qRules DLL inside custom code. We release pretty frequently. Generally, we try to release every quarter. Every now and again, it's 3 times a year. We're always adding to it. We use it internally for our internal forms. We use it in our consulting work, in client forms. We pretty much, as a company, have moved far from writing custom code. If we need a custom code function, we add it to qRules, and that does enhance it. We take suggestion requests from the forum, we take suggestion requests from customers, and we add them into our bug database, and as they make sense and as we can get them into the product, we add them. So using qRules lets you have complex logic without maintaining custom code. So the very basics, I'm assuming everybody has it installed. First off, we need to run setup exe as admin. I'm hopeful most everybody's off of XP by now and is running Windows 7 at least. But when you go to install qRules, if you right-click setup exe and run it as admin, that allows the click once security to deploy this as admin. The reason behind this is there's a third-party library that the tool uses to extract all the files from your form template and pack it back up. And that third-party library has 2 versions, one for 32-bit, one for 64-bit. And in the logic of that library, we've got a little wrapper on it that allows us to extract the correct DLL needed based on your system. And so without the proper permissions to basically write back to this program files that has the injector the very first time it's run, you run into some issues. If you don't install as admin, that's okay. The first time you run qRules, just go to the program files, right-click the injector, and select Run as Admin from there. That'll handle the same thing. You close your form template, you inject your form template. qRules is code. We don't want you to ever think that it's not, and so because it's code, it does have the same restrictions around it that you would find with a form template that you added code to yourself. So that means that if this is a browser form, it has to either be sandboxed or it would have to be admin deployed. we've got basically the way qRules works is there's a changed event on the command node. So once you've injected qRules and you take a look at the newly injected qdabra rules data source, you'll see the command node, and all the documentation is we'll set the command node and do this. So there's a changed event on that basically takes whatever text is in that node and tries to act upon that text, okay, and then it clears it. There's a success node in the data source that generally is going to let you know whether or not your command succeeded, although we're developers, so sometimes our version of succeeded might be different than a form designer's definition of succeeded. Like, for example, to me, success means the command executed completely, whereas to somebody else it means the command did what I wanted it to. And so there is sometimes a little bit of misinterpretation of what success means in terms of from the code module versus from the designer's point of view. However, there's an error node, and we return error information there. We've worked really hard to try to make that error information helpful. Sometimes it's still not, and sometimes it's still super geeky. We're returning what's called the stack trace or something like that, which gives us as developers some deep information on where the error is occurring, but gives the form designer less helpful information. At the same point in time, we do return error info there, and it can be helpful if you do think you've run into a bug. It can be helpful to get that information back. Command field can be set with rules on other fields, rules on buttons. Some commands return information to the results node. Now, one thing we added in 4.3 and later is that you can specify, I think actually we added this in 4.2 now that I think about it. I think that's a typo on my part. You can specify a data source and a data source node, an XPath, for the result to be returned to. So for example, with something like date diff or generate GUID or something like that, instead of having to add an additional rule to set your data source, your field value, to the value of the result node, you can return directly to it. And I've added some to our first lab on that. And I would really suggest you give that functionality a try, because I think it greatly simplifies things, and I use that a lot now in newer form work that I do that has 4.2 or later injected, because it saves me a rule step, and I'm always happy to be saved a step. I'm a very lazy form developer. So if you, whoops, let me go back one. I'm also bad at PowerPoint, just so everybody knows. So if you need to pass in a form value to your command, you use a concat statement. You use a concat formula. Otherwise, you can just type the value in the value box for the rule. Now, the thing is, it helps people to keep in mind that the only thing the command cares about is the string that's in it. It doesn't care how you got that string. So the command executes based on a string value. Now that means you can test a command pretty easily by just typing what you think you want in there, right, and tab out. So drag all these secondary data source fields on there, type in what you think the command should be, tab out, and the command will execute. You'll find out if you've got an error or not. But then if you need to use some form values, like let's just say field 1 has a value you need for a copy table command, or field 2 has a value you need for another command, a date diff or something like that, then you need to use a concat statement. And if there's an error in your concat statement, the command won't execute correctly. So since we clear the command field after each use, sometimes for troubleshooting purposes, you might want to also set another field's value to what you're trying to set command to so you can see it. Or if you're working with a browser form, temporarily change the compatibility to fillers so you can pop up a dialog box and see what that command says, whatever it takes to see what might be going wrong. So I usually like to make sure I can see that command text when I'm using a concat statement if I run into trouble. If you're using InfoPath Form services, you're using a browser form, then you want to set post back to always on fields and buttons that execute commands. So you've got a field, field A, and when field A is filled out, it's going to execute a command. If you do not set post back to always on field A, it is most likely that you will not see the results of your command until the form does post back. So you might have some other thing in the form that you do that then posts it back. For example, you might go to close your form thinking, oh gosh, this is broken. And as you close it, the form will perform a post back, and in the background you'll see the form actually is doing what you want it to do. So be sure with qRules commands that you do set that post back to always. The form that you are dealing with on your machine when you're filling it out in the browser is going to have to talk to the server to execute the code in the DLL and return the results back into your form. So it does have to have a post back, and setting to always means it's going to happen for sure. Okay, now I can't change slides, right? I can only change them when I don't need to. So commands, I think, you know, I work under this theory that it helps qRules users know what I'm thinking when I develop qRules. Now, I could be entirely wrong on this. Nobody has disillusioned me thus far. So if I am wrong and nobody really cares how the developers think about this product, it would be useful to learn this from someone, and do fill me in. But in the development of qRules, as we work on things and add commands, we tend to try to make them as modular as possible. So I think of the commands as like Legos, right? It's you know, here's qRules, it's a whole bunch of Legos. Now go build something, right? And so sometimes you might look at a command and be like, wow, that's weird. Why does it do X and not Y? And you know, for example, like change submit URL. All that does is change the URL in a submit connection. It doesn't actually execute the submit. Well, that's to give you more leeway. That's to give you more freedom. That's to give you more options. It's very easy to add a rule that executes a submit connection. So why would we also execute the submit in this instance? No, we're just going to change the URL. So when you run across something that looks strange or small, or you're like, why does it just do this one little thing? That's because we want you to be able to take that one little thing and stick it together with all the other little things to really customize stuff. You know, I talked briefly about the error node. We use try-catch blocks in our code a lot, and a try-catch block says, go try to do this thing, and then if any exceptions spring up, catch them so that I can handle them. And when we do exception handling, we handle for the exception by returning information for the user, or maybe there's a different way we can do this thing, and we will go ahead and we'll try this different way because there was an exception, and then if there's another one, we'll return it to the user. So in code, we can do some robust things to improve the user experience. Using qRules and leveraging the error and the success node is going to allow you to add the kind of error handling that you might be able to have in code. So you want to experiment. When you unit test your form, you want to do things wrong so that you can see what the user experience is going to be when there is an error. If you can't figure out a way to do things wrong, get an actual user to test for you, because they certainly can figure out a way to do things wrong. I mean, it blows me away. It's so easy to get way too close to what you're working on. And so we sit down and, oh, I'm going to try my form that I created, and we fill it all out perfectly right. And you give it to an actual user, and you're like, oh, wow, cool, that just blew up spectacularly. It can seem really overwhelming because there's so many commands and we keep adding to them. With 4.2, I spent a ridiculous amount of time revamping the user guide and organizing things into groups. I actually did the same thing with the code, so the code's organized in the same kind of folders because the number of commands was getting just hard to deal with. So I think the user guide is more browsable now, and I encourage you to browse through it. And again, if you're ever thinking to yourself, I wonder if qRules does this, you know, post to the forum, email me, whatever, and we can tell you whether or not qRules does that particular thing. I even forget commands sometimes, and we'll be like, well, does it? Oh yeah, I guess that is in the user guide. So qRules injects a code DLL, an XML file, and a schema into your template. We're going to take a quick look at that. It overwrites your existing template. Save a copy first. And that's because what if you are just experimenting and you're trying something in your form and you're like, yeah, I can get by without this, and this is a browser form and I really don't want to have to sandbox or admin approve. In that case, you're going to want to remove qRules. If you've saved a copy prior to injection, you can just roll back. If you haven't, it can be removed. It's not impossible. It takes a couple steps, and we've got information in the user guide for that. It's not that hard. So I'm going to do a couple little demos. Now, if you've installed qRules prior to, I think, 4.3, we've gone through, if you've been with qRules for a while, we've gone through a bunch of iterations trying to figure out the best way for installing the full trust forms. We tried adding it to the installer so it was part of the installation as a custom action, and that failed on some machines and then gave users no way of trying again to get these installed. We've tried JScript. We've tried little install scripts. People have done okay with those, except for sometimes on some machines they're associated with other applications, and then that creates a whole world of nightmare. So now we've got this new little tool. We call it Form Installer EXE. If you have InfoPath open, you're going to have a bad user experience. In fact, we're gonna just go ahead and look at that right now. I'm going to go ahead and just show my I'm going to show my whole monitor, and we will go from there. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the little widget that's supposed to, whoops, hey, back, that's supposed to be showing me what you guys are seeing, so hopefully it's correct. So when you install qRules, qRules goes into your program files, or x86 if you're using a 64-bit machine. And here's qdabra software, and here is qRules. So here's all the stuff that installs when you install qRules. It's all right here. And there's a folder called Forms. Now, what we and I've got junk in mine because I've been doing stuff again, but that's the way it goes. We also add on the Start menu here, if you go down and find it, under Tools, qRules, right? There's also a link to this folder, so you don't have to navigate to it the hard way. If you click that link, it will also open up this Forms folder, okay? Because we're trying to make this easy, right? But at the same point in time, it has to be within the realm of the possible. So here's Form Installer EXE, and we just go ahead and literally you drag your file onto it. Now, it asks if you want to install. If I said no here, it would uninstall it, okay? I'll say yes, and it was successfully installed. Yabba-do. And so if I wanted to uninstall, I would just say no. Do you want to uninstall? Yes. Uninstalled. Okay, and so this little Form Installer EXE, you can use this with any full trust form that you want to install. Okay, it's a handy little tool. So now let's just pretend that I have InfoPath open. And let's see what we've got going on when I try to install. Now, this should not just fail, but it should fail slowly and somewhat spectacularly. Oh, look at that. It didn't. I must not have actually had InfoPath open. Let me try again. I'm going to pop open a form. All right, so now I've got a form open. And let's see if we can get this to fail. I want it to fail so you can see what the failure is like. Well, apparently we're not going to fail today, so I give up on that. At any rate, when it fails, it generally tells you, it gives you a COM exception, which is not a very nice exception. It'll give you a form template cannot be installed with a COM exception. And a lot of times what we found is that it's not just that InfoPath is open, but that there's an InfoPath task running. So I'm going to try opening InfoPath again. Let's just get this guy open. Okay, so I know he's open. Oh, that's hideous. Let's minimize him again. Okay, so he's open, he's minimized. So if we start the task manager and we go to processes here, the one you're looking for is right here. Okay, and so sometimes what we find is when we have a failure, even after you've closed InfoPath, you might have an InfoPath process hanging. So if you're having trouble installing the full trust forms, make sure you don't have InfoPath running. Check the task manager, check the processes. If you have an InfoPath process still running, then go ahead and end it. And I mean, I'm just a glutton for punishment here. So since I know I've got InfoPath up and running right now because I can see it, see what it's doing? It's closing it for me. Isn't that useful? I guess that's another thing to be aware of. It might close InfoPath for you. So that's how the full trust forms are installed and uninstalled now. We updated the documentation on that. Accessing your full trust form after it's been installed, again, you can just do, you can go to that folder link here, open it up, and then from here you should be able to open up that full trust form. Let me just pop it back over onto this monitor and make it smaller. There we go. So you can open it like that. You can also, with full trust forms, once they're installed, you open InfoPath. You go down here to installed forms, right? And here's one. Here's some of my other installed forms right there. Okay. So that's how we install and uninstall these days with qRules. Hey, I'm not saying this is not going to change again in the future either. It just we keep iterating through this. We keep trying to find a way to make sure things are going to work successfully for the most users the most times. And so this is our latest attempt at that. So now what I'd like to show you is, I talked a little bit about injection and what happens with injection, and let's take a look at the form files so you can see those. So I'm just going to create a new blank form. This is InfoPath 2013. Right now, qRules is only tested for 2007 and 2010. So I'm going to save my form in 2010 format. With qRules 5.1, which will be our next release, we're working towards getting everything tested with InfoPath 2013 and SharePoint 2013. But it's just, it's in the works. So here's my new blank form. I'm going to do a file save as, and I'm going to go throw it here in my training folder. There's nothing to make you feel like your file system's a mess than, sharing it with the world. Okay, so there's my form. It's saved. I'm going to close it. Let's pop back into my training as soon as I can find it. Here we are. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I have some freeware installed called 7-Zip, and I use it a lot for extracting form files. Now you can go to File, Publish, Save as Source Files, and that's one way to save your form as source files. I tend to not really be wanting so much to work with form files as to look at form files. I often find myself wanting to look at form files, so generally speaking, I'll just use 7-Zip. I mean, if I were to open this now in design mode, it would need to be resaved, right? Because it right now it has no concept of its location, but 7-Zip works well for me. And so here is the qRules injector. I'm going to go ahead and inject my manifest. So you can see right now, simple form. We've got our XSF, we've got our XSD schema, we've got sample data and template XML, and we've got our initial view. Sample data contains all of the XML for the entire form. It contains samples of secondary data connections and so on. Template XML is the XML for the main data source and includes things like non-calculated default values. Take a look at these files sometimes if you're a curious person. So here we go. Manifest, we know we're 2010, we're browser, we're sandbox. This guy right here, admin deploy, he's a new option. We have a couple commands, submit as user, and I think we're going to be modifying render form to only get injected for admin deploy. So these are commands that only work correctly when the form is admin approved, not sandboxed. So sandboxed is when we publish our form with code directly to the library. Admin approved is when we publish and we say, yes, we're going to be putting it on SharePoint. Here's the URL. I'm going to admin deploy it. We save it to the network, and then somebody with access to central admin uploads it. Okay, so we're going to inject. Here's our backup warning that makes me crazy, and injected successfully. Now we look at our forms. 1, 2, 3 new files. Okay, so this is the qDabra data source. That is the schema for the data source. That's the DLL. The other thing we do is we write to the sample data and we add information about the qDabra XML there. And so now when we pop our form into design mode, we have our new data connection. right? And that's pretty much what it does. So, you know, if you needed to remove this, you could remove the data connection. You could go under Data Resource Files and remove this resource file, right? And you would pretend like you were adding code, and then you would be able to remove code. So if we go here to Language, remove code is disabled right now, but if you add like an onload event, then you would be able to remove code, and that would pull out the DLL. So that's just a kind of quick and dirty how to remove. Okay, so we are going to do a lab. This is up on, let me just go to the, oh, you know, this is so useful the way every time I click it, it changes slides. Either that or I need to figure out how to use PowerPoint one of these days, right? Let's go to our training site. I could not remember if it was HTTP or HTTPS. And lab materials are here under Documents. So if we go to Lab 1, this guy has the module, the lab module, and it's got the form. I think this is the completed form. So if you run into trouble while you're walking through the lab, that completed form might help you. Again, we should be able to start here. I believe it was on page 6 because the first few pages of this lab are installing installing qRules and how to inject and things like that. It's just a real basic kind of a date diff thing. I did add to the lab so that you can try the result XPath and the result data source. Actually, I think it's just using result XPath because it doesn't have a bunch of secondary data sources. So you can hop in there and give that a try. I think that this lab, I can't see that it should take more than a half an hour. So I'm going to pause recording, let you guys work on the lab, and we'll start up again at with the next module at 10 a.m. precisely. If you have questions, chat them or ask them in the little question editor, and I'll probably zip off for about 2 or 3 minutes, but I will mostly be right here if you have a question. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and pause my screen and stop recording and mute. And again, if you have questions with the lab or if you have trouble accessing, please do a chat or ask a question and we'll make sure you get access, okay? Okay, moving on. Next we're going to talk about copying data. So copying data was one of the reasons with, let me just click to open the question pane. We had a question, and I'm only coming up with one result, not 4. I just see we've got a question from Nancy. Is qRules 4.3 required for this lab? I have 4.2, and I'm only coming up with one result, not 4. I will, Nancy, I'm going to go ahead and we'll go through this copy data portion, and then I'll get back to you on that because I'm kind of confused by the question. So I have to actually look at the lab so that I know what you mean when you say you're coming up with one result and not 4. Okay, 3 of the 4 text fields are blank. Hey, Nancy, send me your form. Hillary, you probably have my email address. Send me your form, and I'll just send it to all, and I will take a look at it after when we take our next break and we do the next lab. And that goes for all of you. If you're having a problem with the lab, go ahead and email me your form, and when you get started on lab 2, I can address any questions you had from lab 1. So just send it along to me with your questions. I'll address those while you're working on lab 2. Okay, so moving along with copying data is one of the things that's kind of at the heart of qRules because it's an ongoing problem. We see it in the forum all the time. It's a challenge we see in forms that we design for other companies. We see it in our own forms. Sometimes you just need to be able to copy repeating data from a secondary data source into the main data source of your form. It's that easy, and why that's never been part of InfoPath has always been one of those little head scratchers. Why can't we copy repeating data? Why isn't there a rule for this? And there's some challenges around it, and that's why there isn't a rule for it. It's not straightforward. We have 2 approaches that we can use in qRules for copying data from one data source to another. Actually, there's more than that, so I'll probably digress and go off on another one of my little tangents. But the main 2 scenarios are if there's an exact copy. The source and the destination match in number of elements and attributes. It's not a complex schema. It's not nested. In those scenarios, we use the copy table command. Copy table command is a fussy, finicky beast. It insists that you have the same number of elements and attributes. And the reason it does that is it does a one-to-one copy. It copies the first field in the first data source to the first field in the second data source, and the second field in the first data source to the second field in the second data source. So it's a one-to-one copy, field to field. We don't do anything fancy there. We're not going to match on names or anything else. We don't care what your nodes are named, but we do check in the command that there's the same number of nodes in each data source. This can get tricky with some secondary data sources. We have found that in SharePoint 2007 for sure, and I can't remember if it's still a problem in 2010, but in 2007, if you create a data connection to a SharePoint list and any instance of a field is blank in that, it doesn't actually get returned in the data set that's returned to InfoPath. So your schema looks fine when you look at the schema, but the node itself might be missing, and then it will fail this whole counting attributes and elements. So there's some fragility there. And the other thing is, gosh, how many of us really have non-complex schemas, right? I mean, it seems like every schema has a certain level of complexity. And so with a complex schema, we do insert and set values based on an indicator usually, and that indicator can be something like there's a key in your data source, things of that nature, and we're going to walk through both of these. Now, while my mind is on it, frankly, personally, I'm not using copy table very much at all, if at all. I use insert and setting values sometimes, but lately the two commands I use most often for this type of thing are replace, and that's when I've got an exact replacement, which amazingly enough I frequently seem to have, and so that's when you've got I mean, it's an exact replacement, right? It's same schema and everything. So, for example, sometimes I have a form that has data that I want to copy into a new form, and they've got exactly the same schema. Replace works great for that. The other command I tend to use a whole lot for this stuff these days is transform. And transform's intimidating, and nobody wants to learn to write XSL, and I don't blame you. It's not fun. But boy, that command is efficient. You know, it's super efficient. So if you are doing data copying a lot, insert and set values, it works well, but it's a looping mechanism, whereas transform, boy, it's quick and easy. It's just done. The problem is learning to write the XSL, but let me encourage you to look into those options as well. But at any rate, you can use these techniques to copy data from one data source to another. You might be copying data from a secondary data source into your main data source. I actually have lots of interesting occasions where I'm copying data from one secondary data source to another, and I'll show you one of those here. I've got a little demo. Wow, and so we're moving on to the demo already. I don't have a lot of slides here. Let's pop over and look at that and talk about that a little bit. Let me find this guy. I made it easier for myself. And we're in lab 2. So this is my demo form, and I'm going to pop it open in design mode. Okay, and so here we've got our demo form. Now I've got 3 views in here. This view is just a simple copy data. Here's my main data source, okay, and I'm using this repeating field character. It's got 2 fields. It's got name and it's got ID. Here's my secondary data source. This is a simple group. It's got item and value. I named these things differently from each other because I wanted it to be apparent that that they are not, they don't have to be named the same, right? They can be named differently. We don't care what the names are. All we care about is the count of things being the same. So this is our simple data. Let's take a quick look at it, and I've got a little field here where I insert the command. So here's my main data source. There's nothing in these fields. And then here is my secondary data source, and you can see I've got plenty of information there. So if I click copy, right, now it's all been copied into my main data source. So I've got these IDs and these values. Here's the command I use. DSName SRC is simple data, so that's the name of my data source that I started with. SRC, source, right? It's the source data. We've got source data and destination data here. Table source is simple data. Let's pop back over here. Simple data, that's the container group, the parent group of my repeating group. Okay? Row source is simple group. That's my repeating group. Okay, so you may not need this if this is a main data source. You may not need DSName. If you're dealing with the main data source, we generally do not make you provide that information, right? So you wouldn't include this if it were your main data source. My table source is my container group, my parent group for my repeating group. My row source is my repeating group. Now here's my destination information. You note I don't have a DSName dest, and that's because in this command I'm copying into the main data source, so I don't need it. My table dest, so that's going to be my parent group. Pop over here, right? Characters is my parent group. So you can see this is the XPath for my parent group. Row dest is, again, like above, it's a relative path. We're dealing with relative paths here. It's a relative path to my repeating group. It includes my namespace prefix. Easiest way to get this information, right-click, copy XPath. Okay, and so a lot of times if I'm going to write this command, let me just pop open a new notepad here. If I were writing this command, a lot of times I'm going to do it like this. I copied my XPath and I would do table dest equals control paste, right, and then space in front of that / row dest equals my character, and so I use copy XPath a lot just because it saves me from typos. It doesn't matter that I'm comfortable with XPath or that I generally know what the XPath is that I'm going to use. I'm going to copy it because of that. Okay, so that was a simple one. That's just a copy table command. If we look here under our manage rules, setting fields value. Oh, and I talked earlier in the first lab section about when to use value and when to use FX. Here, I'm just using a hard-coded value. I'm not using any form values in here at all. So my command just goes in that value box. It's just a string, right? If I needed to use form values, I would use FX and insert a formula. Okay? So off we go. Page design. We're going to go to our next one. Now this is a more complex scenario. And this scenario is a little more realistic because, like I said, I think most of us do have more complex data structures. You're not going to go any smaller, are you, you little booger? So here my main data source, right, is this guy. It's this book guy. Let's just make this whole thing bigger. And we'll make you bigger. And looks like I've got... Okay, and so here we have our book group, right? And this is a more complex structure. We've got a repeating group called book, and inside of it, we've got some other folders. Okay, so this is my data structure here. I've got publisher info, copyright info, title, and author. The data I want to copy in here is right here, and it is just like this. And again, this data does also have two folders in it, and it's got basically the same information. But copy table isn't going to work here because of these nested folders. So we're going to use a different approach. And this time, our command, now the first thing I'm doing here is I'm deleting rows. The reason I'm doing that is because I've got data included by default. And so one way you can make sure that this is empty when you get started is you can delete rows. You can, in copy table, there's the empty parameter. You can set empty to equal yes, and that would delete any existing rows. Here I use delete kind of as a cleanup to make sure things are deleted before I insert. The other thing you can do is under default values, right? You can choose not to include things. Right, so you can deselect book and not include it. In case you've not used this before, you can also default to any number of instances, right? So you can add any number of instances here if you wanted. Let's say you always want your form to open with 10 of these nodes. Right? You could add those all 10 here. You could also add default values for all 10 of them. I haven't looked at this yet in InfoPath 2013. I believe in InfoPath 2010 still, if you tried to use a formula for the default value on one of these nodes here in the defaults, it would apply to all of them. So you could not use a different formula for different instances. And that may be a little esoteric. Maybe nobody else is trying to do that, but at any rate, just an FYI. So the next thing I do, first I've deleted rows. I've cleaned out everything that I'm not using, right? I've cleaned them all out. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run an insert command. Now the insert command inserts an instance of a repeating node. Okay, and so if we go look at this formula, we can see, I'm gonna copy this out and put it in Notepad. This is, I tend to work in a text editor. I just have more room there. So our basic command is this guy right here. This time we're using a concat statement. Our basic command is this. So if I were going to try this command hard-coded, right, I would type something like that inside the command field in a form preview and make sure that it worked correct. Like our copy table command, the parent in this case is the container group, the non-repeating group that holds the repeating group, and child is our repeating group, relative path, and we include a count so we know how many of these we want to insert. That's why here I'm using a concat formula. It's because the number of these that I need to insert is based on however many of these there are. So if we do insert, you can see here's my complicated data source and my complicated group. I need to insert as many of these as exist in my secondary data source. Now I'm using an XML data source. Obviously I know how many of these exist in the secondary data source. But if you were using a dynamic data connection like in the real world, you wouldn't know how many items you are going to have until you run the formula. So all this does is this inserts as many of these book nodes as exist here in my secondary data source. I'm going to disable the rules I've got here, and I'm just gonna, we'll look at these in just a second, and so that you can kind of see what my process is when I'm dealing with something like this is I do work kind of one rule at a time. So you can see we've got 3 items here, 1 item here, and nothing's happened here yet. Copy is going to delete my first one, so now I have 3 items here because my insert command ran. So I know my commands are running correctly so far because I've got 3 in my main data source. Right? I'll keep moving this up and down while I make everybody motion sick. And I've got 3 in my secondary data source. So we're good. Life's good. Everything's good. So the next step is I'm going to set a counter. And I'm going to use this counter to help me set field values every single time a book is inserted. So these rules are going to run every time a book is inserted. So my insert command runs, it inserts 3 or 4 or however many of these book nodes. Each time a book node is inserted, these rules are going to run. Okay, so my counter is going to set a field's value, and it's going to set book counter to the count of preceding book plus 1, because preceding sibling for the first one is 0, and for the second one is 1. Right, the count of preceding sibling is always kind of 1 less than the position. So I add 1 just so that it makes sense to me. You can also use it without the 1 added as long as you add 1 when you go to set values. So this counter now gives us something that lets us know which instance is being inserted. Is it instance 1, instance 2, instance 3? Okay, so now we know which instance is being inserted, and I'm going to enable this, and now I'm setting some field values. And I'm using my book counter to index which complicated group I want in order to grab the correct value. Okay, so my book counter here, it's in my form logic. We'll go take a look at that in a second. It's in my form logic, and my book counter is being used to indicate which one of these complicated groups I want. So let's go look in Notepad again. And you guys are probably familiar with this XPath, but I just want to make sure I'm being perfectly clear. If I do this will get me the story field from the 3rd instance of complicated group. Okay, and if I do this, gets me the 2nd one. Okay, so my book counter field is changing values. When I insert my first instance of book, my book counter value is 1, and therefore I get the first instance of story. When I insert the second one, it's 2. I get the second instance of story. The reason I'm using the number function here is because InfoPath doesn't believe me that this is a number, and generally speaking it will not return anything except for the first instance, if that, of complicated group, if it's not explicitly informed that this is a number that it's using. There's other options. Sometimes I've added 0, and adding 0 convinces InfoPath it's a number. I know, I shouldn't say I know, I think I recall in 2007 the number function was not available in InfoPath Form services in browser forms, and I believe that's when I started adding 1 to my count, or 0 to my counter, in order to make sure that InfoPath was interpreting it as a number. So just be aware that this is something that you have to kind of keep an eye on and make sure it's working correctly. And I had somebody tell me the other day that when their counter was in their main data source, it didn't function correctly even with the number function. But I haven't had a chance to try that. I don't know for sure if that was maybe something else that was going on in the logic in the form. So I go through and I set all of these fields based on that book counter. Got other options here. If your secondary data source has a unique value that's a key, you would set the key in the main data source, and then you could have rules on that to go set the other fields, right? So there's lots of options here. So we'll just take another quick look with all of this logic enabled. Do a view, and we'll do copy. Command use is kind of pointless here because, you know, there's so many different things being used. But at any rate, you can see now all of our values from our complicated data source have been copied into the main. So the final scenario I'd like to show you is one where I'd mentioned this, is this idea of copying data from one data source, one secondary data source, into another secondary data source. And that's one of those things that I don't think on first glance makes a ton of sense until you have a scenario where, for example, you want specific data shown as a display in something like a drop-down, and you don't have that data accessible to you for whatever reason. Let's say you're using a SQL data source and you've got a DBA who won't create a view for you. I've heard of such things happening. It's terrible. Or if you're using a SharePoint list for a data source and you don't want to create some other column that kind of munges the data together in what you want to use for a display. So, or you've got a list of dates and you'd like to use a specifically formatted date for your display. So there's all of these kinds of scenarios that we get into. Internally, we have a time card form where we want the data sorted one way in the main data source. We want things sorted according to priority in the main data source. But man, oh man, that was making the thing hard to use in the drop-downs, right? Because, I mean, sorted according to priority, I don't know about your brain, but my brain works alphabetically. And so we just needed to do something different in order to be able to use these drop-downs. And we used a secondary data source. We dumped the data into the secondary data source. We use a qRules sort, and now all of a sudden we can fill out our time cards without wanting to cry. It's very useful. So in this case, I've got this secondary data source, and this is just an XML data source, and it's got a field called display and a field called value. And so in my drop-down, we've got, well, in my drop-down here, right, I'm using my drop-down data source. I've got value and display. Okay, and so that's what I'm using for my drop-down. So it needs to get some data. Now this is my original data, and it comes from an orders list in SharePoint, okay? And it's got an order date and a customer, and you'll see that the order date is rather ugly. And so what I've done is I'm copying the data. Now again, we're using delete rows. Since this is a secondary data source, the default data doesn't make a difference unless you set it so it doesn't have any rows in the XML in your resource file. Okay, so you could export your resource file after you create your secondary data source here. You could export your resource file and you could remove the date nodes. You could do that, or you could just use delete rows, right? So much easier. And so here I'm deleting these date rows. The next thing I'm doing is I'm inserting rows, right? And this is exactly the same as we did in the other one. This time I'm just counting those row nodes that are coming back from the SharePoint orders list. So this just gives me the same number of rows as I've got, right? It's very familiar. And then I'm sorting the table. Okay, so let's talk about order operation. order of operation. When I insert rows, if you're just looking at this logic, you're like, she inserts the rows and then she sorts the table. How bizarre. She's sorting a bunch of blank rows. But of course I'm not, because when I insert the rows, logic fires on my date field. Okay, and I'm using set counter. I've got a different counter that I'm using for this so as not to cause confusion in my form. And it's the same logic that we used in the more complicated copy data. And then I set the value field. Okay, and so see, this condition is sorting is blank. Well, when we sort, we actually delete and re-add all the nodes. So when we sort, we're taking all of our nodes that we're supposed to sort. We sort them, we delete the original nodes, and we re-add the sorted nodes. That's just how sorting is handled in XML in C#. And so using this condition of is sorting equals blank makes me, it protects me from having these rules fire again while this is being sorted. Okay, and we'll take one more look at that in a second. And I'm setting the value field to the order date for that particular drop-down counter. Okay, down we go. And here at value, if value is not blank and is sorting is not blank, then my order date is a date. So I run a format date command, and then I set the display to the result from the format date command plus some customer information. There's a pound symbol in there because it's a lookup, so I'm getting a substring after that to ensure I just got the customer name. Okay, so now I'm setting display to something special and different using this logic. So is sorting, if we go back to this guy, you'll see when we go to sort it, we set is sorting to 1, and then we sort, and then we set is sorting back to blank. So generally speaking, if I've got logic on a repeating node, and if I'm going to also be sorting that repeating node, I use a helper field, and that helper field is to allow me to use some conditions in my rules to make sure that things don't run when I'm sorting. It's just a simple XML, and we set is sorting to 1 or back to blank so that this other logic doesn't run right here when we don't want it to. Okay, so it's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're building browser forms, because I have seen some instances in browser forms of event bubbling where if I change one thing, the parent item's rules fire. It's just something to watch out for. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and preview this for you so you can kind of see what all that talk was about. So here's my original data. Here's my date. Not very pretty at its best, right, with the 00 times. And here's my customer. It's a lookup, and so it's got the ID from the customer list, semicolon pound, and then the customer code. Not pretty at all. Okay, and here's my drop-down XML, and right now there's nothing in this because I've just got these 2 blank values. So if I create drop-down, click this. If I create drop-down, now what has happened is first our command ran to delete the existing items from the secondary data source. Second, our command ran to insert rows into the secondary data source. Third, the command ran, I'm sorry, not the command, logic on the date node. Let's go here. Logic on the date node set a counter and then set the value field. So let's go back here. The value field was set, right, for each of these instances. Now, I'm working on the assumption that this order date is unique. Obviously, it's probably not, but again, you would use something, you'd probably use something unique for that drop-down value. The next thing that happens is logic on the value field sets the display field. So once this ran, it executed a command to return a formatted date, and then from there, it set this display field to a substring of the customer code, right, everything after the pound symbol, a colon, and the date to give me a prettier drop-down so that when my user goes to use the drop-down, right, now they've got something we're assuming would be a little more useful to them. Okay, so that is that is just kind of a demo on some of the approaches with copying data. Let me get some of these things out of the way because I think I also wanted to show you one other thing. Adding resource files for XML connections. So the reason I want to show you this is I have a pet peeve, and I'm I'm so certain that everybody cares about the same things I do, right? that I have to share my pet peeve with you. So if we go look here at our resource files, you see how all of my resource files have their XML extension. But if we were to do what people often do, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do File, Save As, and I'm going to call this guy. A lot of times when we add a data connection and we're adding XML, we go here, we go Manage Data Connections, Add, right, Receive, XML. It's all, you know, this is all, we click the Browse button, go find that guy, add him, say Open, right, Next. And oh yeah, we can't leave it on the local computer. Include the data as a resource file, or we choose to include it as a resource file because obviously we know that nobody's going to be able to locate it on our machine if we leave it there. We hit Next and Finish and Close. So now we've got our XML data connection. If we close this and we go look at our resource files, here's temp, right? No XML extension. Okay. Now let's pretend that we made a change to temp and we want to modify it. Right, and we'll do this. We go Browse, we select him, we've changed him, so we need to update that. We go Next, Next, Finish. And now we go look at our resource files. Look, temp1. Now InfoPath is going to keep doing this, right? Every time you click that Browse button and you browse to that XML file, it is going to keep adding until you have temp 12 and temp 25 and temp 415, right? So instead, what I usually do is I either add things to the resource files and then add a data connection, or you can do something like this. You can add, I'm sorry, I'm sure you're just sick of looking at this data connection wizard, XML document, and then I click resource files, add, I add my new resource file, I say OK, and then I go Next, Finish, Close. I only walk through the data connection wizard if my schema needs to change, right? I always add my XML through the resource files dialog because what I want in the end, when I'm all done, I want only one XML file for each of my XML data connections, and I do not want to have to do a bunch of manual cleanup like remove temp and temp1. The other thing that's helpful with only one XML per resource connection, per XML connection, is that when you do things like this, when you go look at data connections, it's pretty apparent that your temp data connection should be using temp XML, except this one isn't. It's using temp1. Right? And it gets a little messy if you should happen to look at your form files in order to ascertain what's using what. So just, you know, again, it's a little pet peeve, but I do think it's easier to add things that way. Then when you export from your resource files, it's got the XML file extension. If you've got an XML file that you're using for logic, you can change any of the values in that XML file and just re-add it to the resource files, overwrite the existing, and that'll be reflected the next time the data connection loads. If you change the schema for that XML resource file, then you need to walk through the data connection wizard again. So just a little thing to keep your forms from getting cluttered. If you do use data connections to XML files, I encourage you to at least check these resource files and get rid of the ones you're not using if you've made a lot of iterations, which, you know, I think a lot of us do make a lot of iterations when we go through these things. At any rate, that's kind of it for the demo. We've got a copy and insert lab. If you're using the training site, there's a point in this lab where we create a sample list. Use your initials at the end of the list, or whatever your sign-in name is, whether you're rosemary or mint or thyme, whichever herb you got. And that way you'll have a unique list name because we are going to reuse the list tomorrow. Ask questions as you have them. Nancy, I saw that you've uploaded your form to the doc library, and that's great. I will take a look at that one and let you know what the issue is with it, so that you're squared away on that. And we will regroup at 11 o'clock, I think, and holler if you have any questions, and then we'll go through the next demo and lab, and we'll call it a morning. So I'm going to go ahead, stop recording, pause, mute, all that stuff, but I'll be keeping an eye on the question and the chat windows, and holler if you have questions with the lab. Now, hopefully everybody was able to at least get somewhat through the lab. Nancy, I'm sorry there were some technical difficulties there with creating the list from the XLS. Like I said, I had a little trouble with that the other day myself. I ended up having to add it to my trusted site. So I had a security issue of some kind. At any rate, if you have questions on the lab, feel free to pop them into questions. I can answer them during the next lab. If you had an issue with a form template, got stuck, anything like that, let me know. Nancy, I emailed you on what was up with your previous form template, and I uploaded a fixed version to the same Lab 1 file, so you can take a look at that. And we'll just go ahead and get moving on. And so the next command we're going to look at, this also was something that was added very early to qRules. It's called Save to SharePoint. And the Save to SharePoint command allows us to basically take the attachments the user adds to the form, save them off to a SharePoint document library, and then replace them with a link so that the user has a link they can click on to open the attachment. If you are also a DBXL user, we do also have a command called Save to DBXL, which does something very similar. It creates an XML file in DBXL that has the content of the attachment in it. And so this allows you to let your users attach away to their forms, but prevents the form from getting, massive in size. We don't want that huge XML because of it having all these attachments in it. If we save our attachments and images to their own SharePoint library, it keeps our XML, from being so bulky. I don't know if any of you have ever run into the problem, but I've definitely seen forms that are slow to load due to the size of the XML. Some caveats that you need to be aware of for this is the user does need permissions to write to the library the file is being saved to. Okay, in qRules, the default Save to SharePoint option uses an HTTP put command, and so since we're using HTTP put, the user has to have permissions to write to the library. We have another option with that command. You can use the copy web service. That can be useful if your form is published to a different SharePoint server than the server where you need your attachment saved to. The copy web service is going to let you cross domains, but not, I think, in a browser form. I think only in filler. And there's some things there to kind of keep your eye on. Again, as always, test often. Deleting requires some more logic. I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit more in the demo, and we go through it in the lab. The thing is what we do with qRules is when you run the Save to SharePoint command, we take your file out of we take the base 64, which your file attachment node, as I keep going back to the very beginning, in the beginning when they developed InfoPath, no, in your file attachment node, your file attachment is being saved as base 64. Okay, that's an encoding type, and we're going to look at that because it's fascinating. I know you can't wait. And so it's saved as base 64, which is a string. So the qRules command turns it back into a file, right, and then uploads it to SharePoint. It then clears the node that the file was in. So your field that it was connected to the file attachment control is then blanked. It's cleared. And then values are written to two attributes that your field has to have in order for the command to function: qRules link and qRules file name. If you're missing either of those attributes, the command will fail and it will give you an error. And we do run into a lot of people who aren't accustomed to adding references to nodes, so we're going to do a quick demo of that, because if you have multiple file attachment fields in your form and you want all of them to be writing to SharePoint or DBXL, you need to add the same named attributes to all of them: qRules link and qRules file name. Case matters in all of these things. It needs to be the correct case. This says if browser plus sandbox, you may need to use the copy web service option. Now with SharePoint, no, it wasn't a SharePoint change, my bad. With qRules 4.0, I believe, we added calls to the SharePoint object model. And once we did that, browser plus sandbox, you can use Save to SharePoint without the copy web service option. So there were some problems with this command due to security issues in browser forms, but I believe those are resolved now as of 4.0. As with all form work, right, plan in advance for optimal outcome. I mention that here in specific because I think with this command more than so many others, it's extremely important to know what your users are going to want to do with their attachments. One nice thing about replacing the actual attachment with a link would be, in theory, somebody could go to the document library, they could open up the file, they could make changes to it, they could save those changes, and the link in the form is going to point to that same file that's been updated. Now, it could be, in your scenario, that's not desirable. Right? It could be that you're in a scenario where the file needs to not change, or if it's changed, it needs to change at the same time something in the form changes. Or if it changes, we need to have a way of knowing that in the form so that the next time I open the form, I know that that file has changed. All of these things are the sorts of things you want to take into consideration when you design your form as much as possible. I totally get that we publish forms, we set users loose on them, and they come back and say, but that's not what I meant, right? Or the requirements change. Or a frequent thing I've seen is people don't know what they can have. So they think that they are going to ask for things and that they're not going to be able to have them. So they ask for kind of a minimum feature set. And then we show them, oh, here's your minimum feature set that you asked for, and they're like, oh my gosh, you can actually do all these things. Well, what about these other things that I didn't dare dream of? Can you do these as well? And so once you get a user, an actual user involved with your form, you will see scope creep and feature creep. But as much as possible, if you can ask the questions up front, oh, well, when you attach a file, how should the next person who uses the form interact with that file? Those kinds of questions. Can you delete a file once it's been attached? If you can ask these questions up front, I think you can spare yourself quite a bit of rework. So popping over, this next slide is just the little demo slide, blah, blah. And let me pop open a form and let's take a look at some stuff. First off, actually, I want to show you this. What I did was I opened up an InfoPath form that had a file attachment control. And I attached a picture to it. And so this node right here, that node is my my file attachment node. It's a base 64 node, and you can see it's got the two attributes, qRules link and qRules file name. And I attached a picture to this node. Okay, so this is a picture, right? And that's what it looks like. That is the base 64 for a picture. Now you can find online base 64 encoders and decoders, and I've got one up right now that I'll show you real quick. This is a picture, so I know that it's going to generate a picture formatted file. And if I pop over here, you can use anything you find online. Just give any of them a try. I'm trying this particular one, and I did just try it, and I pasted in my base 64 string. So here's my base 64 string. We'll just go ahead and pretend like we're all brand new, right? And after testing this once, I found out that I do want to force output to a new window, and I'm going to decode. This is an encoded string, right? And I'm going to say yes. I want to save this as a file attachment because I know that it's not going to. The tool that he's got here isn't, or she isn't built for this particular kind of a thing. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and it went into my downloads folder, right? So if I open my folder, here's my guy. Now he doesn't have a file format. I happen to know because I attached the file that it's a ping. But we'll just go ahead and pop him open, and I'm going to just open him with Windows Photo Viewer. Right? And so here's my little picture. It's a little screenshot of an emoticon that I like. It's a little bunny. And so that's just what we're working with here behind the scenes, and that's so you know what InfoPath is working with, because as always, knowledge is power. And when we attach a file or a picture to a form, what we get behind the scenes is we get this encoded base 64. Okay, so that's what a file attachment looks like in your XML. So the next time you need to open up an XML for something, for whatever reason, it won't open with a template, it's being stubborn, you just want to look at its innards. If you see something like this, it's a file attachment or a picture. Okay, so going on, let's go take a look at adding a reference. up 3. And it looks like, oh, we'll just use this file. We'll design him. Okay, so I have a file node here. He's base 64. He's an image file. He's an image, and he's got qRules link and qRules file name on him. So now I'm going to add a new one, and this is going to be my accounting information. We'll pick on the accountants because it's easy, and he's base 64. Okay, so there he is. So now I've got a second file. Now I know I have to have qRules link and qRules file name on this as attributes, because otherwise my qRules command will fail. It will give me an error message saying, oops, you're missing the required attributes. What's wrong with you? So if I just say add, whoops, let's spell it right. Oh my goodness. qRules link. So if I try to add this, here's the message I get. And you've probably seen this message before working with InfoPath, maybe not even with qRules. You've seen this message before. A field or group with that name already exists. Now, the thing I missed the first 100 times I got this box was that right after that, it gives me instructions on what to do next. And I continually seemed to not read those or not really grok them. It says, if you want to create a field with the same name, right-click the existing field, click Reference, and select a location for the new field. All the properties of the new field will always match the properties of the existing field. That second part that starts with all, we're going to talk about that in just a second. We'll say OK, we'll say cancel. So here we go. We're going to say reference, okay? And we want the reference to go here on our accounting information field. Say OK. See how we've got 2 now? We do the same. Reference. Now, I use this a lot because I'm a schema snob. And so if I have a date field named date, and I've got several groups of information that require a date field, I'm not going to put in names like process to date if I have a group called processing, right? I would just add a reference to my date field there to my group called processing. So if I had, we're just going to humor me for a little bit. I don't know why I pick on accounting so much. If I had a group called accounting, and then I had another group called approval. Whoops, I'm a mess, aren't I? Let me delete that. Let's try again. Let's try again. Well, my casing is just all over the place today. Here we go. Here's my other group. So I've got 2 groups, and I've got a field in here, and it's named user, and this is my user, my accounting user. If I also am going to have a username in my approval, I'm going to reference, right, so that I've got 2. Now, remember I said that we were going to talk briefly about that little statement in that dialog box that said all blah 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 of the original field will also apply to the other field. So if I set user, either one of them, I don't have to go back to my initial one. If I set it to a data type of Boolean and say, okay, this one, properties, is also Boolean. Okay. Now you might have noticed when I hovered over it in the fields task pane, it was still showing as string, but that's just because it was taking the IntelliSense or the tooltips a second to catch up, right? And so now they're both Boolean. Okay. And if I add an attribute here, this can be so convenient. It can also be a pain. So you only want to use references if you are truly dealing with like things. If they are like things, it's great because real world sample, I've got a form that I'm working on that has a little group called permit information, and there's like 5 other groups that require this permit information. So when there was a new field to add the permit information, I added it to the folder 1 time, not 5 times, and not with a bunch of kind of made-up names with additional characters just to kind of make it to allow me to add that additional field, right? Because I just added it to one of my groups, and all of my reference groups also got the new field. Great time saver. But if these things aren't really the same, right? If they're not really the same thing, then it might not make sense because now we've got this new attribute on user and our approval user doesn't really have an attribute. You know, in that case, you might not want to use a reference for something like this. However, the one thing that you do get to do with referenced fields is you get to have different values. So I can set this user to have a default value of true and say OK, and this user's default value is still false. Right? I'll change this one to 0, or right? And so you can have different default values with a referenced field. And that was another thing that confused me quite a bit with references when I first started working with them. So that's references. You'll use them a lot if you've got a number of fields in a form that are going to be using Save to SharePoint or Save to DBXL. One thing I usually do in my forms is I probably do have a single field that's called File that has link and file name on it, and then I might use that same field inside of a number of different groups. You know, I might have a reference to it in accounting, I might have a reference to it in approval, and so I'm more likely to use references and assume that my XPath tells me what file this is. You know, I know it's accounting because the parent group is accounting. And the other thing I was going to talk about a little bit was deleting, and we do go through this in the lab. And I just want to kind of walk through it a little bit because it's outside of qRules. It's not something we're doing within qRules. It's a data connection that we're using. So if we look at manage rules for this delete, I've got delete file. And so here's our problem when we're designing this form. Is we've got this fancy functionality. The user attaches a file to the form. We magically whisk it off to SharePoint, and we create a link they can use to get back to it. So we rock, right? We've got that all taken care of. And the user's left with absolutely no way to remove the file. So we don't rock so much because the user makes mistakes. You know, we all make mistakes. We attach the wrong file. We attach the file and then we think, oh gosh, John sent me an updated copy of that, right? And we go and we get the right file and we want to attach it. So you know, users make mistakes, and we have to give them a way to back out of those when that happens. But our file is no longer here, right? Our file is no longer in these nodes. Our file is gone because when we saved it off to SharePoint. So to delete it, we actually have to go to SharePoint and delete it. And I've been talking about something entirely different because we are using a qRules command for this, so that's great news. You can see we've got delete from SharePoint, and the URL we're using is the qRules link. What in fact I got confused on was attachments. So let me just go ahead and show you so you know I am not crazy, because it's deeply important to me that I not be crazy. In Lab 5, sign. Yes, okay. So we're going to address this in Lab 5. My apologies for getting these mixed up. When we attach a file to a SharePoint list, we don't have a qRules way of getting rid of it should the user change their mind. So in this case, we will use, instead of a qRules command, we use a data connection, a delete attachment data connection from the SharePoint lists web service. Okay, so we're using the delete attachment operation for that. So this gives you something to look forward to on day 5, and my apologies for mixing myself up. This one's pretty straightforward. We just use delete from SharePoint. And what I usually do with stuff like this is I actually, a lot of times with Save to SharePoint, I execute it on the change of the field itself. So if file is not blank, then I execute the command. It takes the user out of it. I think it's a better user experience that the file just automatically gets updated. Then we usually display the link in a hyperlink format so they can click it. And with the delete button, I generally do, you know, something like this. Let's just tidy it up a little bit here. Borders and shading, I do none. I do no color. Button properties. You can find fancier X's in your character map. right? And so I usually do something like that. So you'd have the hyperlink, and then you'd have a little red X. It would be like, click here for file. You click the red X, it goes and deletes the file from SharePoint using the qRules delete file command based on a URL that's in the qRules link. And then you clear some fields. You clear qRules link and qRules file name, because you're probably using those to indicate whether or not to show the file picker control. So at that point, the user has the file picker control back. The library is empty. We've removed that. The attributes are clear. We've emptied those, and the user is able now to pick a different file, and then the process begins again. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody too badly by skipping ahead to the logic on attachments and deleting attachments from lists. But hopefully if I did, the lab will clear that up. I'm going to go ahead and not save all of my cajillion changes here. Okay, so we do, oh, this is my bunny emoticon. You'll see him in the lab screenshots too. He's just my favorite little guy. So we do have another lab, and please, if you have questions or issues, pop them into the questions box, and I'm trying to keep an eye on it. Pop them into chat. If you had issues with the previous lab, get me your form and let me know what your issue was, and I can help you get those squared away. We'll go ahead and just plan on working on the lab until about 11:45, 11:50. I've been trying to do about a half hour for the labs, and hopefully that's the right amount of time. And then I'll pop back in, and we'll see if anybody has any questions, and we'll wrap up for the day and talk about what we're going to work on tomorrow. So I'll pause recording and screen sharing and all that, and let you guys get to work on the labs. And again, do ask questions if you have them.